Comrades, today I speak not merely to your ears, but to the very consciousness that has been chained by centuries of deception. The day you understand exploitation is not a day of idle reflection, it is the day your chains begin to crumble, the day the world you thought was natural is revealed in its true, brutal form. Look around you. Observe the glittering cities, the bustling markets, the endless machinery of production. All this wealth, all this power is built upon the unseen labor of millions, labor that is stolen from the hands of the workers, the laborers, the producers of society's very sustenance. You are not the masters of this world. You are its silent architects, your sweat and toil pocketed by a class that calls itself owner, a class whose only right is the accumulation of wealth at your expense. Do you feel it? That invisible weight pressing upon your shoulders. That weight has a name: exploitation. Exploitation is not an accident. It is the mechanism of capitalism, a system that thrives on your labor, while denying you the fruits of your labor. Every hour you work, every skill you hone, every drop of your energy the ruling class claims as theirs, turning your creativity or vitality into profit. And for what? Not for you, not for your children, not for society, but for the enrichment of a tiny few who live in opulence while you struggle for survival. This is the law of their world, the unspoken contract that binds your life to theirs without your consent. But do not despair, for clarity is power. The moment you see exploitation for what it truly is, the moment you recognize that your poverty, your insecurity, your alienation are not individual failures, but systemic impositions, everything changes. You no longer wander blindly in a world of false choices. You see the machinery, the gears of capital grinding against your humanity, and you begin to understand your place, not as a victim, but as a potential liberator. Class consciousness is the spark that ignites revolution. To understand exploitation is to understand the social order, the hierarchy of power, and the lies that have kept you obedient. And here's the truth that must shake every complacent heart. Capitalism cannot survive without your consent. Its prosperity depends entirely upon the extraction of your labor, the surrender of your autonomy, the alienation of your spirit. You produce the wealth, they appropriate it. You build the cities, they own the walls. You feed the nations, they profit while you hunger. Every law, every institution, every ideology has been structured to maintain this imbalance. And yet, you are not powerless, for every act of labor, every hour of exploitation, contains within it the seed of resistance, the kernel of revolution. Comrades, it is time to awaken from the illusion of competition and division. The ruling class will tell you that your neighbor is your rival, that your misery is natural, that your dreams are unattainable. Do not believe it. The true power of society resides not in the hands of a few, but in the unity of the many. Workers of every trade, every city, every factory, hear this: your solidarity is the greatest threat to the exploiters. Your collective strength, the only force capable of dismantling the structures of oppression. To unite is not merely a strategy, it is the moral and material imperative of your existence. But unity is only meaningful when combined with understanding. Do not be seduced by charity or reform alone. Do not mistake crumbs for justice. True liberation requires the reclamation of your labor, your life, your destiny. It requires the creation of a society in which the product of human toil belongs to humanity, not to private coffers. It requires the overturning of a system that profits from your deprivation and replace it with one that values your freedom, your creativity, and your equality. The day you understand exploitation is the day you see clearly the enemy, the system, and the possibilities that lie beyond it. It is the day you recognize that your struggle is not a personal grievance but a historical necessity. It is the day you realize that your power is immense because you are the source of all wealth, all production, all progress. And when this understanding takes root, you cannot remain passive, for passivity becomes complicity, and complicity perpetuates the very change you now see. Rise, comrades, organize, speak, resist, and act. Build networks of solidarity, share knowledge, awaken minds. Make the invisible visible. Make the exploited conscious of their strength. Let the unity of the working class become a force so formidable that no fortress of wealth, no army of law, no ideology of oppression can withstand it. For history is not written by the oppressors. It is written by those who refuse to accept oppression, by those who take the labor of their hands and the intelligence of their minds to reclaim the world as it should be just, equitable and free. The chains are not eternal. The system is not inevitable. The day you understand exploitation is the day the world itself becomes transformable, the day everything changes. Exploitation is not a mere coincidence of human society, nor is it the product of isolated acts of greed. By a few individuals, it is a systemic phenomenon embedded in the very structure of capitalist society. From the moment one begins to engage with the world of work, one encounters the mechanisms by which labor is appropriated, commodified, and transformed into profit for those who own the means of production. The worker, the producer of value, is caught in a cycle where every hour of labor, every skill applied, every ounce of energy expended becomes a resource extracted not for their benefit, but for the enrichment of another class. The working class is the creator of all wealth without their toil. The machines lie idle, the fields barren, the shops empty, the services non-existent. Yet, paradoxically, the wealth that springs from the collective effort of millions is concentrated in the hands of a few, who live not by labor but by the ability to claim ownership of the instruments of production. This is not a matter of chance, nor is it a fleeting imbalance. It is the defining feature of the capitalist system, where exploitation is codified in laws, enforced by institutions, and justified by ideology. Consider the nature of labor itself under capitalism. The worker does not merely produce for personal satisfaction or for communal benefit. They produce for the market, for the extraction of surplus value that becomes the profit of the capitalist. Every manufactured good, every service rendered, every invention developed bears the mark of this extraction. The laborer invests time, creativity, and physical effort, yet the fruits of that labor are systematically siphoned away. Wages are offered, but they are never equivalent to the value created, never sufficient to reflect the true contribution of the worker. This discrepancy, the gap between the value produced and the value received, is the core of exploitation. It is not an arbitrary theft. It is a structural inevitability. The system requires that workers receive less than they create so that owners can accumulate more than they contribute. Without this mechanism, the hierarchy of wealth and power that defines capitalism would collapse, and the privileged few would no longer maintain their dominance. The process of exploitation is reinforced by the social and ideological apparatus that surrounds it. From birth, the working class is conditioned to accept its position as natural, inevitable, or even virtuous. Education, media, and cultural norms present a world in which competition, individualism, and the pursuit of profit are glorified, while the collective labor that sustains society is undervalued and obscured. The worker is taught to identify with the success of the system rather than to question it, to seek advancement within its confines rather than to challenge its foundation. This ideological manipulation ensures that exploitation continues without conscious resistance, embedding it so deeply into social consciousness that the unequal distribution of wealth appears as a matter of merit rather than as the result of structural oppression. The capitalist does not simply exploit labor, they exploit belief, conditioning workers to accept their own subjugation while appearing to participate freely in the system that diminishes them. Historical materialism reveals that exploitation is not a contingent feature, but a historical product of specific social relations. The ownership of the means of production, the factories, the land, the technology, and the capital is concentrated in the hands of a few, creating an inherent imbalance of power. Those who control production dictate the conditions under which labor is performed, the compensation that is granted, and the distribution of wealth that follows. The working class is left dependent not only on their ability to labor but on the structures designed to limit their autonomy and maintain inequality. Exploitation is systemic because it is embedded in the relationship between those who own, those who work, codified in contracts, reinforced by law and normalized through custom. It is a machine that runs regardless of individual morality, a structure that persists because it is profitable, because it serves the interests of the ruling class, and because the majority remain unaware of the mechanisms that bind them. Moreover, exploitation under capitalism is self-reinforcing and expands over time. Capital accumulates in the hands of the owners, enabling them to acquire more means of production, influence, and political power. The worker, conversely, is left with limited bargaining power, often forced to accept ever-changing and increasingly precarious conditions. This imbalance ensures the continuity of systemic exploitation, as the ruling class leverages wealth to control not only the economy, but also the political and cultural institutions that govern society. Each technological advancement, each innovation in production, each increase in efficiency becomes a tool for further extracting surplus from labor rather than a means to liberate or empower the working class. The system thrives on the continual appropriation of human effort, turning the productive capacity of millions into private profit and consolidating power in the hands of those who do not labor. Thus, exploitation is not a moral failing of individuals. It is the engine of capitalism. It is the structural condition by which the working class produces all wealth while the ruling class appropriates it, a relationship maintained through social, economic, and ideological mechanisms. To understand this is to recognize the fundamental injustice of the system, to see the invisible chains that bind labor to capital, and to realize that the liberation of the working class is inseparable from the overthrow of these systemic conditions. The worker is the creator of all value, the source of all wealth, and yet, under capitalism, the laborer product is turned against them, used to sustain the very hierarchy that denies them justice. This recognition is not theoretical abstraction. It is the foundation for understanding society, for seeing the world as it is, and for imagining a society in which wealth is distributed according to contribution, where labor is emancipated and where exploitation ceases to be the engine of life, and inequality is no longer its inevitable result. Awareness of exploitation is not a superficial realization, but a profound awakening, a recognition that the conditions under which one lives, works, and struggles are neither natural nor unavoidable. This awareness, what we call class consciousness, is the lens through which the worker begins to see the mechanisms of oppression clearly, to discern the invisible threads that tie labor to profit, effort to deprivation, and life to servitude. For centuries, the labor of the many has been appropriated by the few, masked under illusions of fairness, meritocracy, and the natural order of society. The worker is taught to accept scarcity as destiny, to interpret inequality as the result of personal failings, and to perceive the vast machinery of exploitation as a world that cannot be altered. Yet, the moment the veil lifts, the worker sees the structure for what it is, a deliberate, systemic arrangement in which the ruling class depends on the labor of the masses for its wealth and power, and in which the majority are confined to roles that ensure the accumulation of profit for the few. Class consciousness is the awareness that the struggles faced by one are not isolated, that the injustice encountered in one workplace mirrors the exploitation experienced in factories, fields, and offices across the globe. It is the understanding that oppression is collective and that liberation must be collective. For individual escape is always limited while the system remains intact. This awakening begins when the worker recognizes the fundamental discrepancy between labor and reward, between effort and compensation, between contribution and recognition. It is the realization that the products of one's toil, the wealth one generates, are systematically extracted and concentrated in the hands of those who contribute nothing to their production. It is the recognition that every law, policy, and social norm under capitalism is designed to obscure this reality, to keep the worker unaware of their own power. Class consciousness demands that the worker confront not only the visible manifestations of inequality, but also the ideological mechanisms that justify it, the belief that competition is natural, that accumulation by a few is inevitable, and that obedience and patience are virtues. Once the worker perceives that these ideas are not neutral truths, but instruments of domination, awareness transforms from a passive observation into an active understanding, a foundation for resistance. The journey toward class consciousness is inseparable from reflection upon one's own experiences of alienation. Under capitalism, labor is not an expression of creativity or fulfillment, but a commodity, a means to an end imposed by those who control production. Workers are estranged from the products they create, from the process of creation, from one another, and from themselves. This alienation, once misunderstood, appears as personal failure, fatigue, or lack of opportunity. Yet, when viewed through the lens of class consciousness, alienation becomes evidence of a systemic condition. The worker's estrangement is a symptom of exploitation, a signal that the conditions of labor are structured to benefit others rather than oneself. Awareness of this alienation is the first spark of collective realization, the moment when individual suffering is recognized as a social condition, when the person becomes political, and when the worker begins to see that the path to liberation lies not in isolated struggle, but in the solidarity of the oppressed. Class consciousness also illuminates the historical dimension of exploitation. The working class is not merely reacting to contemporary injustices, it exists within a continuum of social relations that have been shaped over centuries. The accumulation of capital, the division of labor, and the institutionalization of inequality are not random occurrences, they are the products of historical processes in which the few secured dominance over the many through the appropriation of labor and the establishment of property as power. Understanding this historical context allows the worker to see that the conditions they face are neither natural nor eternal. Awareness of exploitation is simultaneously awareness of possibility. If inequality is historically constructed, it can be historically challenged, altered, and overturned. This recognition empowers the working class to see itself as the agent of change, capable of transforming society not by appealing to the conscience of the exploiters, but by organizing collectively to reclaim control over labor, wealth, and the structures that govern life. Moreover, class consciousness unites the struggles individuals into a coherent understanding of collective potential. The worker sees that the exploitation they experience is mirrored in countless workplaces, industries, and nations, revealing a universal condition of the laboring majority. This awareness dissolves illusions of isolation, competition, and personal inadequacy, replacing them with the knowledge that collective action is the only path to meaningful change. Once the working class becomes conscious of its shared interests, the barriers imposed by ideology, geography, or occupation begin to weaken. Solidarity emerges not from charity or sentiment, but from understanding, from the recognition that liberation cannot be partial or individual, but must be social, structural, and complete. In this way, awareness of exploitation transforms perception into power. It is the moment when the worker sees not only the system that oppresses them, but also the force that sustains it, the labor of the majority, and realizes that this force, once conscious and united, cannot be indefinitely contained. Class consciousness reveals the exploitative mechanisms of society, the extraction of surplus value, the ideological conditioning, and the structural inequalities that maintain domination. It transforms alienation into insight, suffering into understanding, and awareness into the first step of collective liberation. Through this consciousness, the worker begins to comprehend not only the injustice of the present, but also the possibility of a different world, one in which the fruits of labor belong to the laborers themselves, and in which exploitation is no longer the foundation of society. Capitalism is not sustained by the goodwill of the powerful nor by the brilliance of the market. It is sustained by systematic strategies that ensure the dominance of the few over the many. Its survival depends upon the fragmentation of those whose labor creates all value, upon the alienation of human beings from the product of their toil, and upon the relentless extraction of labor in ways that enrich the ruling class while impoverishing the working majority. From the factory floor to the office cubicle, from the farm to the marketplace, the capitalist system is structured to divide, distract, and demoralize, to prevent the recognition of shared interest among workers and to maintain a hierarchy in which the ownership of capital translates directly into social, political, and economic power. Division is a deliberate tactic, a method of ensuring that the majority never unites in opposition, that suspicion and competition replace solidarity, and that the capacity for collective action the only force capable of challenging systemic exploitation is neutralized before it can fully emerge. The capitalist ideology constantly reinforces this division. Workers are taught to see one another as rivals, competitors for scarce opportunities, and obstacles to personal advancement. The rhetoric of individual achievement and meritocracy permeates education, media, and cultural institutions, presenting competition as natural and inevitable rather than socially constructed. Those who succeed are held up as examples of what can be achieved within the system, while the majority is led to internalize failure as personal inadequacy rather than as the predictable consequence of systemic inequality. Gender, race, ethnicity, and nationality are manipulated as instruments of division, create artificial boundaries within the working class to ensure that solidarity is interrupted. Workers are pitted against one another in endless struggles for wages, positions, and recognition, while the system that exploits them remains secure, protected by the very energies that might otherwise be directed toward collective resistance. Alienation is the second pillar upon which capitalism relies. Labor is not merely exploited, it is estranged. The worker does not see the full result of their effort. They are disconnected from the products they create, from the decision-making processes that shape production, and from the satisfaction of realizing the value of their own work. The creative and productive capacities of the individual are subordinated to the imperatives of profit. Labor becomes a commodity valued only insofar as it produces surplus for the owner of capital. This alienation extends beyond work itself, penetrating the social and psychological life of the worker, conditioning perceptions, desires, and aspirations in ways that reinforce passivity. The worker is separated from the collective consciousness that might reveal the systemic nature of the oppression, and in this separation, the ability to challenge the structures of capitalism is weakened. The more alienated the worker, the more they perceive themselves as isolated individuals facing a system too vast to alter, rather than as part of a collective force capable of reshaping society. The extraction of labor is the most overt manifestation of capitalism's dominance. All wealth originates in human effort, in the application of skill, time, and energy toward productive ends. Yet, under capitalism, the worker is paid only a fraction of the value they generate, while the remainder, the surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist. This extraction is not a minor imbalance, but the essential condition of the system. Without it, the accumulation of wealth by the ruling class would be impossible. Profit depends upon the systematic undervaluation of labor, upon the invisibility of the mechanism that convert toil into capital, and upon the lack of organized resistance among those who produce. Workers contribute the substance of society, yet the benefits are concentrated elsewhere, leaving labor itself impoverished in both material and social terms. The extraction of labor is maintained by legal, economic, and ideological structures, all designed to legitimize inequality, to punish dissent, and to maintain a hierarchy in which power and wealth are inseparable from ownership. But in the face of division, alienation, and extraction, there exists a simple, undeniable truth. The unity of workers is capitalism's greatest threat. The system depends upon the fragmentation of labor, and if that fragmentation is overcome, the foundations of exploitation are undermined. When workers recognize their shared interests, the mechanisms of control begin to falter. When collective consciousness replaces suspicion and competition, when solidarity replaces alienation, the extraction of labor can no longer proceed unchallenged. Strikes, collective bargaining, cooperative production, and organized movements are not merely tools of negotiation. They are the very assertion of human power over systems designed to dominate, to divide, and to exploit. The unity of workers transforms them from passive producers into active agents of social change, capable of dismantling the structures that have been imposed upon them and constructing alternatives rooted in equity, justice, and shared prosperity. Capitalism's reliance on division, alienation, and labor extraction means that the liberation of the working class is inseparable from the overcoming of these forces. Solidarity is not optional. It is a historical and material necessity. Awareness of common exploitation, the refusal to internalize isolation, and the collective organization of labor are the strategies through which workers assert their power. Each act of unity, each recognition of shared interest, each movement that challenges. The separation imposed by capitalism strikes at the heart of the system. The threat of unified labor lies not in abstract ideology but in concrete economic and social reality, a class that produces all wealth but has the capacity to act collectively, cannot be indefinitely subdued, cannot be endlessly exploited, and cannot be permanently divided. The more clearly workers understand the mechanisms of their oppression, the more effectively they can resist, organize, and reclaim control over their labor and their lives. Capitalism depends upon the illusion of inevitability, yet its survival is conditioned, maintained only by the failure of the working class to see its own power. Division, alienation, and extraction are effective only so long as consciousness is fragmented and solidarity is absent. Once workers perceive their common interests and act in concert, the foundations of capitalist dominance begin to crack, revealing the potential for systemic transformation and the possibility of a society in which labor is valued for its human significance rather than its profitability, and in which unity replaces exploitation as the organizing principle of social life. True liberation is not a passive aspiration. It is an active, deliberate process that requires a profound transformation of the conditions under which human beings live, work, and relate to one another. It is not achieved through mere reform or the redistribution of small benefits, for such measures leave intact the structures that generate inequality, alienation, and oppression. Liberation is the reclamation of labor, of life, and of collective power, the recognition that human beings are not mere instruments of production, not commodity to be bought and sold, and not passive subjects of a system that extracts value from their effort while denying them agency over their own existence. To reclaim labor is to assert the right to control the conditions, purpose, and outcomes of work. Under capitalism, labor is subordinated to profit, the worker's effort is appropriated, and the product of their skill and creativity is transformed into wealth for the ruling class. True liberation demands the reversal of this relationship, the reorientation of labor so that it serves human needs, human development, and collective flourishing rather than the accumulation of private capital. Work must cease to be a mechanism of domination and become a tool of human empowerment, creativity, and social benefit. Reclaiming life is inseparable from reclaiming labor. Under systems of exploitation, existence itself is regimented and constrained by the imperatives of production, consumption, and economic competition. Time, energy, and attention are extracted from the individual to sustain the wealth, privilege of others, leaving the majority alienated from their own experience of living. True liberation requires that human life be returned to those who live it, that individuals and communities gain autonomy over the rhythm of daily existence, over the cultivation of meaningful relationships, over the pursuit of knowledge, culture, and creativity. Life must be organized around human needs and aspirations rather than the dictates of profit. When individuals reclaim their own existence, they cease to be passive participants in a system designed to exploit them and become active shapers of the conditions that define society. Labor, once liberated from coercion, becomes an expression of life itself, a manifestation of human capacity rather than a tool for domination. Collective power is the third and indispensable dimension of liberation. Individual acts of reclamation, while necessary, are insufficient to dismantle systems of structural oppression that have been entrenched over centuries. Capitalism and hierarchical social orders derive their strength from the fragmentation of the working majority and the alienation of individuals from one another. Collective power, forged through solidarity, organization, and shared understanding, challenges this fragmentation. It transforms the abstract potential of liberation into concrete action capable of reshaping society. When communities, workers, and marginalized groups unite around common interests and shared goals, they form a force that can overturn entrenched power structures, democratize decision-making, and create social institutions rooted in justice and equity. Collective power is not only a means of resistance, it is the very essence of a liberated society where authority is distributed, participation is broad, and the well-being of all members is the organizing principle of social life. Liberation, therefore, is a comprehensive process. It requires a simultaneous transformation of production, social organization, and consciousness. The reclamation of labor, life, and collective power is inseparable from the dismantling of hierarchies that concentrate wealth, privilege, and decision-making in the hands of a few. It involves the creation of conditions in which the fruits of labor are returned to the producers, where social relationships are grounded in cooperation rather than competition, and where political and economic institutions are accountable to the people rather than to private interests. This transformation cannot occur piecemeal, for the structures of oppression are interconnected. Exploitation, alienation, and inequality reinforce one another. Only a holistic approach, rooted in collective action and systemic change, can realize the vision of true liberation. Moreover, liberation is an inherently social and historical project. It emerges from the recognition that the present conditions of labor, inequality, and alienation are neither eternal nor natural. They are the products of specific social, economic, and political arrangements that have been maintained through laws, ideology, and coercion. Understanding this historical contingency empowers individuals and communities to act with purpose, to organize strategically, and to reclaim what has been unjustly denied. Liberation is, therefore, both an act of reclamation and an assertion of historical agency. It is the refusal to accept imposed conditions, the demand that society be reorganized to reflect human potential rather than privilege, and the construction of social relations that prioritize the well-being of the many rather than the enrichment of the few. Reclaiming labor, life, and collective power is also a moral imperative. Exploitation, alienation, and domination degrade not only material conditions but human dignity, creativity, and potential. True liberation restores these essential dimensions of humanity. It affirms the right of all individuals to meaningful work, to self-directed lives, and to participate fully in the shaping of society. It recognizes that the emancipation of one is inseparable from the emancipation of all, that freedom cannot exist in isolation, and that the realization of human potential requires the transformation of social conditions as a whole. Labor ceases to be a tool of oppression. Life ceases to be a vehicle of mere survival, and collective power becomes the instrument through which society is reimagined and reconstructed. In essence, true liberation is the overthrow of systems that exploit, alienate, and divide, and the creation of conditions in which human labor serves humanity. Life is self-determined, and collective power ensures justice, equality, and the flourishing of all members of society. It is a process that requires awareness, solidarity, and sustained action, a transformation of both material conditions and social consciousness, and a recognition that only through reclaiming what has been taken can a truly free and equitable society emerge. Understanding exploitation is not merely an intellectual exercise, it is a profound awakening that reshapes the very way one perceives the world, the social relations that define it, and the structures that govern human life. Exploitation is embedded in the daily realities of the majority, yet it often remains invisible, obscured by ideology, custom, and the normalization of inequality. The worker labors tirelessly, produces wealth, and sustains society, yet the benefits of their effort are systematically claimed by those who own the means of production. To comprehend this is to pierce the veil of social illusion, to see the mechanisms of profit, power, and control for what they truly are. Once the structures of exploitation are understood, perception itself is transformed. 1. No longer interprets poverty, oppression, or alienation as the result of personal failure or natural order, but as the predictable outcome of a deliberate system designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few while subordinating the majority. This awareness destabilizes the foundations of consent that sustain oppression, for it replaces acceptance with insight, misrecognition with clarity, and resignation with the potential for organized resistance. Understanding exploitation illuminates the interconnections between economic, social, and political life. It reveals that poverty is not random, that inequality is not coincidental, and that suffering is not inevitable. Every wage paid, every job secured, every resource controlled is part of a system in which labor is converted into surplus value for the ruling class, while the worker receives only a fraction of what they produce. This clarity exposes the systemic nature of oppression. The structures that extract value from labor are reinforced by laws, institutions, and cultural norms designed to maintain the status quo. Recognizing this, the individual sees that their struggles are not isolated, nor are they anomalies. Are shared experiences of a collective class bound together by common conditions of exploitation. Perception shifts from the individual to the collective, from the private grievance to the social reality, allowing the worker to grasp the larger forces that shape their life and to understand that liberation is inseparable from collective action. The transformation of perception that arises from understanding exploitation naturally compels action. Awareness alone is insufficient if it remains abstract or passive. True insight demands response. When one sees that the fruits of their labor are appropriated by others, that social hierarchies are maintained to benefit a minority at the expense of the majority, and that every institution under capitalism functions to reinforce inequality, there emerges an ethical and political imperative to act. The recognition of injustice becomes inseparable from the need for intervention, organization, and resistance. Action takes multiple forms, from conscious solidarity with fellow workers to participation in collective bargaining, to joining movements that challenge exploitation at its root. Understanding the system also guides strategy, enabling the oppressed to target the mechanisms of control, to unite across divisions artificially imposed by race, gender, or nationality, and to coordinate efforts that amplify collective power. Class consciousness is the bridge between perception and action. Once exploitation is understood, workers recognize their shared interests, the commonality of their struggle, and the potential for collective agency. This consciousness transforms alienation into solidarity. The individual no longer sees themselves as isolated and powerless, but as part of a force capable of shaping history. The act of organizing, speaking, and acting in unison is empowered by knowledge, for insight into exploitation reveals the vulnerability of the system, the dependence of the ruling class on labor, and the leverage inherent in the unity of the majority. Action, then, is not merely reactive, it is strategic, conscious, and transformative. It becomes the practical extension of understanding, the application of theory to life, the translation of awareness into revolutionary force, the revolutionary potential of understanding. Exploitation lies in its capacity to reveal both the injustice of the present and the possibility of a different world. By seeing the systemic extraction of labor, the artificial scarcity, and the manipulation of ideology, workers recognize that their condition is neither natural nor immutable. They understand that change is possible, that collective organization can alter the distribution of wealth, restructure power, and create institutions that reflect the interests of the majority rather than the privileges of a few. Insight transforms despair into determination, resignation into strategy, and suffering into a conscious struggle for emancipation. It ignites the understanding that the social order is a human creation, maintained by consent and force, and therefore capable of being reshaped through collective action, struggle, and revolution. Moreover, understanding exploitation fosters a moral clarity that distinguishes just action from complicity. The worker realizes that to remain passive is to participate in their own oppression, that every act of submission reinforces the structures of inequality, and that liberation requires both awareness and intervention. This moral imperative drives solidarity, fuels activism, and underpins the strategic organization necessary for systemic change. The oppressed recognize that their power lies not merely in individual effort, but in the coordinated, collective assertion of rights, in the reclaiming of labor, wealth, and social control from those who exploit it. In essence, the comprehension of exploitation transforms perception, revealing the underlying mechanisms of inequality, alienation, and systemic control, and compels action towards social revolution by converting insight into collective organization, strategic resistance, and the pursuit of a society structured around justice, equality, and the emancipation of labor. Comrades, we have journeyed together through the truths of our condition, from the recognition of exploitation to the awakening of class consciousness, from the understanding of division, alienation, and labor extraction to the urgent call for collective power and liberation. We have seen that capitalism is not a natural order, nor is oppression the result of individual failure. It is a system built upon the labor of the many and the enrichment of the few, sustained through division, alienation, and the concealment of our strength. But we have also seen the power that lies within us, the capacity of the working class to perceive, unite, and act, the potential of labor, reclaimed for human life rather than profit, the transformative force of collective action guided by understanding and solidarity. True liberation is not abstract. It is a struggle, a conscious and deliberate effort to overturn the structures that exploit us, to reclaim our labor, our lives, and our power, and to reconstruct society on the principles of justice, equality, and shared prosperity. The day we understand exploitation, we no longer consent to oppression. The day we act together, the foundations of the system tremble. Our strength is in our unity, our insight, and our courage. History is ours to shape, and the revolution begins when the working class recognizes its power, refuses to accept anything less than freedom, dignity, and the right to determine its own destiny.